call to attention. All right. Look how disciplined you are. We sat up here and everybody started to calm down and be quiet. So we have another great panel in a series of panels today. This panel is labeled Universities as Sites of Autocratization and Resistance. And we have 3 panelists who will be presenting. I'll say a couple of things at the beginning, but we're going to focus on the panelists. We have Selma Bratberg, who's a student here in... No, she's going to tell you who she is. And Nalifer Nazrul, who is a student, yes, here in Bergen, but has other experiences that she will tell you about as well. So, and Jackie Dugard, who many of us know. Enough said. Bruce Wilson, who's listed as the moderator, is not here. My name is Dan Brinks. I'm at the University of Texas at Austin. And interestingly, for my presence here today, the University of Texas has been a site, a target of sort of autocratizing measures and moves by what I think are autocratic actors at the state level, so state legislators in the state of Texas. It's been a site of global politics with a fairly significant kind of set of student protests happening at the end of last semester, and a site of repression of those protests. We had about 150 people arrested on campus. We had the presence of mounted state troopers with weapons and tear gas and various other things, students who were injured in the process, and obviously we're a site of global politics with students as very sort of prominent political actors. In fact, I was here last year and I gave a talk on sort of how all the attacks on the university that were taking place in the state of Texas, and in the context of sort of those attacks on the university, I went to the legislature to testify against these legislative measures, and there were more students there testifying against the measures than there were faculty, right? So even though the measures were things like, we're going to abolish tenure so we can more easily fire people who say things we don't like, we're going to ban the teaching of critical race theory, and we're going to ban efforts to diversify, so all the diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, and the majority of the people who were there to testify about those things were students rather than faculty, which I thought was really interesting. So anyway, I'm not going to say much more. I might say something a little bit later on if our experience in Texas sort of resonates with some of the things that other people will talk about. But I will now turn it over to Jackie Dugard.
Thanks very much, Dan. So I think the question posed here is, how should universities navigate these multiple and diverse dynamics, challenging the traditional social function of universities, and setting in play traditional academic values of autonomy and freedom? And I guess I would like to just share an example of how not to do it. And that is from the University of Columbia in New York City. And just to start with what happened there, which was that very soon after the 7th of October attacks, a month later, following quite substantial student protest on campus, where I will say that although it was never specified, it seems that some of the posters that set in motion some of the concerns around academic freedom or not, the line there, which, by the way, to my tremendous surprise, I learned, having recently moved to the US, I learned only then that the Constitution doesn't really apply in private university spaces. So this question about what freedom of speech is allowed and what isn't. So as far as I could ascertain the issues, the speech that caused the problem at Columbia were a couple of iterations of "from the river to the sea," Palestine will be free, and also "we don't want any Zionists here." Now, instead of having a discussion on campus about what this speech represented, was it acceptable or wasn't it, where do we draw the line, instead of that happening, what happened was that the student organizations, the two main student organizations, were banned. So that was a month later. And following that, a whole set of actions in play, which culminated in donors withdrawing money. It culminated in our president of Columbia, Manoush Shafiq, being brought before Congress for hearings into anti-Semitism, which I will also say that clearly it was the anti-Semitism angle was clearly for many of the Congress people a ruse for the actual war against diversity, equity, and inclusion. And you could tell that because some of the questions went like this, and I am quoting directly. One of the Congress people said, so how do you feel, President Shafiq, how do you feel about students calling for an infatata? So there was that. And then there was the question about they had obviously done a lot of homework, and they found some orientation material from student organizations that referred to FOLX. So President Shafiq was asked, what is this FOLX? And I don't know whether she was kidding or whether this was genuinely the first time she'd seen that ever written, because she said, well, that, I don't know what it is. I think it must be a spelling error. So that's the type of thing that was raised at the congressional hearings. And on that very same day, the students responded, and here comes the resistance piece. The students responded by starting the first encampment. To my knowledge, this is the first major encampment, pro-Gaza encampment in the US. And a day later, the president, bypassing Senate, called in the police, telling the police, the premise was that all of the students in the encampment had been suspended, which founded their ability to come in for trespass. It was not true. The students had not been suspended. They only received their suspension letters afterwards. And then actually, while the police were dismantling those encampments on a lawn, I should say this was a peaceful encampment of a lawn. As they were being dismantled, the students just simply walked across to the other lawn, there are two lawns, and started the second encampment on the second lawn. And that encampment, because of the pressure from faculty, who by this stage, even moderates were like, okay, this is where we draw the line in terms of defending. We have to defend academic freedom, the right to protest, freedom of expression, etc. And that encampment was allowed to go on for 3 weeks before that was dismantled. The police were called in, etc. And a third encampment came after that. According to the New York Times, the highest number of students of any university in the US were arrested at Columbia, 217. Multiple student disciplinary processes. The first one, again, bypassed the university process and was put in this Orwellian center called the Center for Student Success and Intervention, without any oversight from academics, without the ability to have student advisors, faculty advisors, student advisors, or legal representation. Finally, we managed to get those taken away from there. In any event, at the same time, faculty were dismissed, a non-renewal, etc. One particular colleague of mine had his contract revoked because he had, quote unquote, indoctrinated students. I think the tipping point for the university regarding him was a presentation he did on Palestine, epistemic coloniality and the university, dealing with healthcare workers in Gaza. So in conclusion, I think I would, offer this as an example of how not to deal with the admittedly complex decisions you have to take as a university. At the same time, I'm in a program on human rights at the Institute for the Study of Human Rights. We have a master's program. The students were pressurizing us to put out statements. So this does raise some questions which perhaps, I don't know, resonate more broadly, is how does one, in a context of this type of atrocity, should we be putting out statements? Should we be putting out statements for every conflict, for every war, or only certain ones? We took the decision, rightly or wrongly, at the Institute that we would not normally, until there were such times as student rights were compromised, including arrests, including doxing, and including their procedural rights in disciplinary processes. But we did stick to the stance, and this is maybe something we can discuss more about whether universities, whether institutes within universities should be putting out statements at these moments, and in which case, in which conflicts, etc. So I guess that is essentially a long story just to put forward the bottom line, which I think was summed up by one of my colleagues when she said, speaking of the threats posed after October the 7th last year, she spoke about threats of a different kind, that donors have threatened and indeed withdrawn monies and pledges on the basis of Palestinian activism at Columbia and elsewhere. In doing so, they've exposed a difficult truth of private tertiary education, that there is no such thing as ideologically neutral money, that our freedom from state intervention has come at the price of submission to moneyed interests. And I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. Next up is Selma.
Yeah. Thank you. And I'll start by saying a few words about SAI. SAI is a Norwegian solidarity organization for students and academics. We were started in 1961 because Norwegian students and academics wanted to show solidarity with students and academics across the globe, and this was a way to do that. And since then, Norwegian students have been able to fund our work with a small amount when they pay their semester fee, contributing to the work of local organizations, institutions and movements working with access to higher education, inclusive higher education and student rights in Latin America, Southern Africa and Myanmar. So that means we have been working with student solidarity and student engagement and activism for more than 60 years. And with that background, we know that the protests we are now seeing, they are nothing new. They are a repetition of student protests that we've seen throughout history. For example, the student protests against the Vietnam War in the 60s, the Søreide uprisings in 1976 against apartheid government in South Africa, the Fees Must Fall movement in South Africa in 2015. And these are just a very few examples. And I'm lifting this because we are often met when we have engaged, and also when students we know and academics we know have engaged in the discussions around Palestine and Israel and academic boycott, we're often met with that this is something political and unacademic. But my point is that this political activism have has always been part of academia and our universities. And I don't think that's a coincidence that students participate in these kind of protests and discussions. I think it's exactly because they are university students, because at the university, students acquire new knowledge, they learn to ask questions, they learn to think critically. So I think it's, that the student engagement that we're now seeing is building on academic values and tradition. So, to the question of how the universities should navigate all of this, I think, and I think the discussions and the situation might look or looks a bit different in Norway than it does in the US, for example. But I think it's extremely important that universities takes the students seriously. And that does not necessarily mean to agree with the students and to agree with all the demands of the students, but it means to discuss seriously with the students and actually discussing their demands. I have been following the discussion about academic boycott at different institutions in Norway, and I think it's been interesting to see at some institutions it feels like there has almost been attempts to try to avoid the whole discussion and not putting like all the facts on the table when the issue has been discussed, and that's to me that's unacademic and that's not taking the demands of the students seriously. And in addition, taking the students seriously also means protecting their right to protest. Inside, we've done research on repression of student activism for a while now, and we're giving out a new report this fall based on student experiences from 36 different countries. And of course, in addition to more brutal forms of repression that we know that student activists often experience, this report also shows that the majority of students that we interviewed experienced restrictions on their activism from the people closest to them, be it their university, their professor, or their family, both through university lawfare, which students saw as one of the biggest concerns when it comes to their activism. And this includes both like policies used to threaten students with failure, suspension, or expulsion. Or one student also mentioned that they were disqualified as a candidate in the student elections. And then the students also highlighted delegitimizing rhetoric. This could both be from the people closest to the students, their professors or their parents, including by calling them immature or naive, but also from media, politicians, or other sources that kind of strengthens negative feelings towards the students by calling them like rebels or terrorists or dangerous and so on. And also that they experience social pressure from their parents, for example, that the parents are concerned about their activism, that they will get hurt, or that their activism is that they need to focus more on their studies instead of their activism. So this is maybe maybe a bit on the side, but I just wanted to show that I think in this context, the universities play a very important role in protecting student activism, and I think it's so important that the universities are not the ones taking part in the repression of the student activism. And the students that we talked to also mentioned that that because of this more relational repression that they experience, building networks and having safe spaces to discuss with each other is one of the most important things to protect their activism. And in that context, I think the universities can play a very important role.
All right, thank you. Next up, we have Nilüfer Nazrul.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to speak me today. The last year I was here also as a volunteer, as an intern of Law Transform, and I was asking Siri that there are so many countries out there is nothing about Bangladesh. But today I'm here to talk about the recent incident about the Bangladesh that leads from the university students to the national movement and the freedom expression that was actually oppressed for a long time, almost 15 years, that has been restored now after the university students their movement and the protest. So I will talk about the incident that happens recently and the historical context. So today's my I will discuss today about more about the historical context and the recent incident, and try to analyze the recent context from the interventions of the autocratization and the resistance in the Bangladeshi students. The immediate cause of the current unrest is the controversial reservation of government jobs for the descendants of freedom fighters, which we know as the Mukti Jodha. This quota system, which started at 10%, was abolished in 2018, but was reinstated and increased to 30% by a High Court in order in June 2024. This move spread the widespread across the country, and it led to the protest and leading to the violent confront from the government. In July, the Supreme Court scaled the quota back to the 5% with the provision that state government can change the quota percentage at any time. By then, the July protest had already gone beyond just this issue. And what the result? Its result, the fail of the dictatorial government. University and their campuses actually were on the fire, and the main hub for the protest The national flag symbolizes resilience despite the government actions. The government response was very heavy-handed. Almost 10,000, more than 1,000 has been killed, and more than 3,000 critically injured. And the government has cut down the mobile line and the internet connection almost for 5 days. That time there was no media was there because government was controlled over the media. So no one knows about the whole scenario, what's happening on Bangladesh. Even we are in outside of the country, we don't know what's going on in Bangladesh. There was a huge protestation going all over the country, which is led by the university students, but it was fueled to it is spread all over the countries, including the mass people. And there are some kids also been killed on this operation, those who are only 5 years old or 4 years old. So these things actually massively massively spread it all over the country, and this resulted the outrage of the government. The prime minister, she fled out to India, our neighboring country, and there was a massacre all over the country. And so the student resistance movement, they actually took what they did about this resistance. The number one, they protest all over the countries, and they also spread out everything via the social media and YouTube, as all the regular medias like newspapers and the news channels all were controlled. That's why they took the another way. So they spread everything by the help of social media and YouTube. Also, they urged to the expatriates and the migrant people to hold the remittance and don't send the money to Bangladesh from the outside of the world. Like who are working outside of the country, the worker and the job holder from Bangladesh to the other countries, they don't send any remittance to Bangladesh. So students always appeal on that issue. So by 15 days, the coming of the remittance to the Bangladesh is almost halted. So then the government was in huge pressure, which resulted the resign of the prime minister, and she fled. Now, these resistance movement impact on the policies and the national discourse. Number one, the dictatorial government has been ended, and the prime minister fled away. So we have an interim government led by the Nobel laureate, Professor Dr. Muhammad Yunus. And also now we are expecting the voting rights and the democracy will be restrained. And also the freedom of expression is restored. The political prisoners are actually rescued. And now we know that there are so many torture cells. So there are the political prisoners also rescued from that torture cells. And most importantly, students-led national reformation is going on. Students are still on the road. They are trying to reforming the old systems, what was the negative side of the Bangladesh, like the road blocking, the corruption, the things. Students are trying to reforming everything. So this is the resistance things led by the students of Bangladesh. This is a long historical background from Bangladesh, which started from 1952. This all history was led by the university students. In 1952, we have the language movement. In 1966 and 1969, there was also the repression against the West Pakistan, because Bangladesh was the part of Pakistan. We are the East Pakistan, and now the recent Pakistan was the West Pakistan. So we got the freedom in 1971. It's also led by the students. In 90s, also we got the democracy from the military government. It also led by the students. And 2010, 2007, 2013, and 2018. Also, there were so many movements were leading by the university students. And also, all other students from the colleges and even from the schools, high schools, students are coming to resistance to show their show their support to the other students, and other people also like support to this resistance. And thus now in 2024, we are optimistic. We are thinking that Bangladesh will see the new type of democracy, democratical world, and our democratical rights and voting rights will be restored, and we can speak in our own voice. No one will control us. We will not face any controlling power from our government to get the freedom of justice or freedom of expression, anything. So, and yeah, that's the thing actually. So we look forward on that what's going on next day, because this slide I have made 3 or 4 days before, and every day the scenario of Bangladesh has been changing. Every day, because it's very recent incident. Our prime minister resigned on 5th August after this protestation from the university students. So I think that the university students can do many things if they want. And the students, the Bangladeshi students who are in the different universities around the globe, like even us from the University of Bergen, the students we have in University of Bergen, we also show the protestations. And the other students also. We also support the other students who are in Bangladesh. So that's the thing actually we do for our national movement. It starts with the universities and end up with the national movement. That's it. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. So, really interesting accounts of student activism, student protest, student politics, students as political actors, which in some ways sort of highlights why universities would be the target of autocratic efforts and measures. But that's our panel. So if people want to come up and ask questions, we have just about 8 minutes for the questions. So please keep your questions really short, and we'll try to keep our answers really short, and hopefully have a little bit of a conversation.
I'll try and be to the point, but that's the cost of being the first question. But great panel. And it kind of makes me think, listening to three really contrasting experiences of like, what are we prepared to risk in these things? And I've been so struck with the Gaza, Palestine encampments and the crackdowns on them, that the students have risked so much more than faculty often. I mean, we've been slow, right, faculty to catch up, and students have been doxxed, have been, I mean, all, you know, expelled, all kinds of things have happened. So I guess my question is, I mean, I'm not very optimistic about many things at the moment, but I am very optimistic about this movement, this transnational movement of students and faculty, right, of having a different conversation about colonialism and capitalism around Gaza and Palestine. So you're all talking about very, very different contexts, and I know that Gaza and Palestine is more important, obviously, in some contexts than others, and Bangladesh and what's going on in Bangladesh is not the focus of the same kind of transnational student networking. But do you think this is a moment of inflection for global student politics in resisting autocratization?
Thanks.
Thank you so much. I have a question for Niloufar about the situation in Bangladesh. So I wanted to hear, how do you see what the student movement is thinking in terms of, well, what will happen now, right? So to which extent was all this mobilization against that government specifically, or also about the political system in general? Just because I feel that, you know, if they're thinking of having new elections after this interim government, well, the political scenario in Bangladesh, it seems to me that it's very polarized. So where would that lead us? And also if you have any comments on the role of the army in this situation, which for me is also very unclear. And I also just wanted to point out that the situation in Bangladesh, I think it's also very interesting, not only for those interested in South Asia, but also for anyone interested in police abolitionism, because of the experiences that have been going on of students taking over roles that were traditionally assigned to the police, and you know, just figuring out how to do it. And I think that there are interesting things to see what happens there. Thanks.
Thanks.
Hi, Tom Keck, Syracuse. I really enjoyed the panel. So I said during the last panel that the distinctively American approach to free speech has some advantages as well as some disadvantages. And I think one of the recent contexts where we really see the disadvantages come through is in discussions of academic freedom, right? And in the American discussion surrounding the Gaza protests and other recent events on American campuses, there's a real conflation of free speech and academic freedom. Those two principles are obviously related to each other, but they're importantly distinct. And especially if you adopt a, you know, distinctively sort of American, like individualistic conception of freedom of speech, I think it's not helpful, and it doesn't capture the concept of academic freedom in a couple different ways. But I'll just flag one. Historically, at least in the U.S. and I think elsewhere as well, the concept of academic freedom has a real sort of institutional autonomy component, as well as like individual rights of professors to say what they want to say component. And so the recent situation in the U.S. has really cast a light on that, because we have federal legislative committees hauling in private university presidents and demanding that they crack down on specific named groups of faculty and students, and if they don't sufficiently do so, then demanding that they resign. like that is a real severe threat to the institutional autonomy. And I don't trust university leaders to make the right decisions all the time, but I trust federal legislative committees even less, right? Like they are just overdoing it with interventions into university business. And so I'm curious, especially from folks who've worked on these issues and experienced with these issues outside the United States, just for some further reflections on that kind of institutional autonomy component of academic freedom. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you. This was a great panel. I wanted to pick up on Tom's point and what Jackie was referring to as donor pressure. And, really the question is about power, right? And whether it's a state-owned or state-run university versus a private donor-run university. I want to give an example from India, where in Jawaharlal Nehru University, it is the state that sent police on campus against students. And so I think it's interesting, right? Because I think it goes back to what Tom and the previous panel was talking about, the difference in free speech rules, because it's true that academic freedom is a subset of freedom of speech and has these distinct, principles of institutional autonomy and so on. Because when I compare the situation in the US compared to what has happened in India, even in private universities like Ashoka University, where the president was forced to resign, or faculty were forced to resign because of stuff they said which was not acceptable to the government, it was still the state that was more powerful and exercising that kind of pressure, whether it was a state-owned university or a private university, and not so much the private donors that were so influential. So I was wondering whether the background legal rules on free speech also define how this power is exercised in repressing faculty and students.
So I think we're super short, or we should just, if we want to hear from the panelists at all, we should probably cut off the questions now. Sorry. So sorry. But do find the panelists in the break. Why don't we go in reverse order and just take a minute or so.
To responding to Sophia, the recent demand for the students, actually the political reformation, not about supporting any other parties, but the constitutional change and the reformation of the political parties and the political system as well. Because the other parties were trying to put their nose in the issues, but the students suddenly stopped them and they said that we will reform everything. Then we will think about the political and the voting things and the other things. And the role of the military, the thing is, if you see that the military is maybe the 1% of the population and the rest of they're huge civilians. So this is actually the more pressure to the military. If everyone is coming to the road and giving the pressure, where will go with the guns? So these things actually happened on the last few days. Because the military, they were actually getting money from the people, isn't it? If the money is not there, so how will they sustain the military? So yeah, that's why actually they're giving the pressure to the military to obey their system on the things what are they looking for. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Selma? Yeah.
Yes, I think we'll also have to discuss more in the break, but maybe I think it was very interesting what was mentioned about academic freedom and free speech, and I think in the Norwegian context we haven't really we haven't had police on campuses, for example, or things like that. So I think the institutional autonomy has been respected, but I still think it's interesting how academic freedom has been used as an argument, especially in the discussion about academic boycott. As one of the main arguments against academic boycott, which I think part of it is valid, but it also, at least my kind of experience from the discussion is that when we're talking about academic freedom, like there can't be any restrictions at all, while the truth is that we do also put restrictions on the academic freedom, and also your your academic freedom can't infringe with other people's academic freedom, for example. Yeah,
All right.
we can discuss it more.
Thanks.
So quickly to Tom's point, yeah, absolutely about the distinction, subtle or not, between academic freedom and freedom of speech. And I think this is where, you know, I feel that the management of Columbia was particularly bad in not drawing that line and in not defending academic freedom when it was called upon to come and speak to come and speak is one way of putting it, to participate in the witch hunt against women presidents of private colleges. And there she indeed just rolled over and ditched up the academics that were under fire. And again, as I say, you know, it was quite clear, I think, to anybody who watched that this wasn't really about anti-Semitism. This was really about a right-wing agenda in the US to clamp down on academic freedom, academic freedom in the broader sense. And I would just say that the student, to Rachel's point, I think it is pretty extraordinary what students have done around the world in this moment. And, you know, in absolutely pretty extraordinary that the student protest has resulted in the president being toppled in Bangladesh. And at Columbia, we can say in some form or other, the president also has now been toppled. We'll see what happens thereafter.
Great. Excellent. Thank you so much to the three presenters, and thank you for your great questions.